Can you hear me there at the back? Yeah, okay, good. So, well, I have the pleasure now of introducing the president for the presidential address. But Pete said thank you to a lot of people last night, so I think we should also take the moment to thank Pete, actually, for being an excellent president and for being, well, being a supportive mentor to several of us in the stewardship committee as well. So I think, you know, Pete's role is not just our president, but as a good human being. So thank you very much, Pete. And I'll hand over now to Professor Turnbull, El Presidente, to give us. I can hear. You need to use it.
Do I? Okay. Okay. So I'll use this. So let me start with this. When you pick up a book to read a story to your kids, or in my case now, my grandkids, if the story starts with the words "Once upon a time," then you know that your kids can be reassured that there'll be a happy ending. The heroine or the hero will slay the dragon, and they can all go to bed nice and quiet. The only academic book I've ever read that starts with the words "Once upon a time" is Richard Hyman's new concise introduction to employment relations. It says, "Once upon a time, across the English-speaking world, there was a field of study known as industrial relations." So, given that we're talking about place, what I thought I'd do is I'd talk about kind of institutional place. The fact that we're all now in business schools, our intellectual place in terms of our relationship with other areas of the social science, the role of our epistemic community, and also as well reflects on my own particular place in the academy, which I'll start with. If you're not familiar with this particular sketch, it's from the Frost Report from 1964, which was all about class in the UK and looking up and looking down on different classes. We've got John Cleese, Ronnie Barker, and Ronnie Corbett there on that little. So let me just say a few things about my own place in the academy. I studied economics at Leeds University, and that experience for the first couple of years was a rather strange one because of the way we were taught about economics as these utility maximizing individuals, perfectly competitive firms. And I thought I'd pick a couple of examples from micro and macroeconomics that still kind of stick in my brain. The first was in microeconomics, where the lecturer was explaining what we call Giffen goods, where income effects outweigh substitution effects. So the argument is that if you're very poor, you eat margarine rather than butter because it's cheaper. As you become richer, you then switch to eating butter. But then as you become even more affluent, you might then switch back to margarine because you're eating so many fatty foods. The way the lecturer explained this was that margarine and butter both do the same thing. They both lubricate bread. Now, when was the last time you ate a piece of toast and thought, I'm just going to lubricate this bread? Yeah. And then the other was explaining the impact of the supply of money on the economy and inflation in macroeconomics. And this was Milton Friedman's idea of the helicopter dropping money on a community. And I thought, well, why don't you talk about banks printing, like real things that happen that actually explain what goes on in the economy? I was saved by Rodney Crossley, who at the time was the Montague Burton Professor of Industrial Relations, who taught us basically, radical political labor economics. And also Vic Allen, who in the very first lecture told everybody that he was a Marxist, and basically said, you better go and read some Marxism if you want to understand what I'm talking about. So I, of course, went down the library. I thought I'd pick up Capital, but it's a very thick book. And I came across Richard Hyman's Marxist Introduction to Industrial Relations. So I read that instead. Vic Allen was the first, and I think the only person who's been directly supported as an individual member by the association when he was imprisoned in Nigeria trying to organize mine workers and various other people. The association raised £50. That's equivalent to about £1,000 today in terms of purchasing power. There was a great story in the press where he tried to escape dressed as a local tribesman, and the turban slipped, and they found out that he was a British guy trying to, or a Welsh guy actually trying to escape. So that was my kind of introduction to as an undergraduate. And I then worked initially in research centres at the Centre for Labour Economics, then the Industrial Relations Research Unit. When I went to Cardiff, I was umming and ahhing about whether to take this job. We were 3 years into a 5-year contract at the Industrial Relations Research Unit, but had been reliably informed that the Economic and Social Research Council was probably going to cut the funding to the research unit. And Keith Sisson advised us that we might want to look for jobs elsewhere. I remember umming and ahhing about this. I think it was Paul Edwards who said to me, if you don't go to Cardiff, where would you go? And basically what he meant by that is that, you know, it was one of the foundation chairs in industrial relations. When I went there, I was teaching first year industrial relations and also teaching industrial relations to maritime studies and international transport students, which is one reason why I got into doing research on dock workers and other transport workers. Flipped around to Leeds University, then back to Cardiff. And then in 2015, I joined the School of Economics, Finance and Management at Bristol, precisely because it was a school of economics. And I thought it would be great to teach industrial relations to economic students. And we had at that time 20 students on our straight business and management degree, because you had to have A-level maths, grade A, in order to do the management degree. Of course, we've dropped that since. We've got lots of students, and we're now the University of Bristol Business School, like everybody else. My first BUIRA conference was in 1990. And before I come to mine, I've recently been corresponding with Christine Edwards, who you may recall we gave a BUIRA fellowship to last year. And the first time an early career researcher was allowed to speak at a BUIRA conference was in 1978. I thought it was Christine, so I contacted her. I said, was that actually you? She said, yes, it was. And she said, my paper on union power received a very mixed reception. It challenged the orthodox of the all-powerful shop steward, using a theoretical framework informed by political science, qualitative and quantitative data rather than case studies. The vicious attack was led by Bill McCarthy, and I was looking up the times for the next train home. We had a discussion earlier this morning in the EDI session about whether people feel welcome at BUIRA. My first encounter in 1990, we'd done a first paper on dock strikes using a little econometric model, and the reforms of the late 1960s had failed to reduce industrial conflict in the docks. And this was Paul Edwards again. Paul said to me, well, actually, if you look at the book by Dirk and McCarthy and Redmond, they have 4 hypotheses about why dock strikes fail to decline. No data, but just, you know, hypotheses. We had the data to test these. So at the 1990 conference, I saw Bill McCarthy and I said, oh, Professor McCarthy, we're testing your hypotheses. And he looks at me and just walks off. Never said a word. And the next time I went to BUIRA was 6 years later, by which time, you know, once you're a bit more established, then people actually wanted to talk to you. And it was this kind of thing that you had to be kind of more established in the field before people would recognize you. I think it was last year I said that, you know, the common joke about academics is that there are 2 certainties in an academic's life. The first is that you'll die, and the second is that all your hypotheses and theories will eventually be proven wrong. What you hope is that the first thing happens before the second thing. I think maybe Bill McCarthy thought that the second thing was going to happen before the first thing. I don't know. So most of us, I mean, we've commented on this before, and it's a widespread observation that industrial relations is now basically taught in business schools predominantly. And there's an interesting paper by Martin Parker in, I think it's in Sociology or Sociological Review, where he basically says that while industrial relations scholars are not necessarily at home in the business school, we've basically made it our home. And there's a nice quote here from Ed, who fortunately is in the audience, about business schools receiving a bad press, not least from those who work in these institutions. And that's especially the critical management studies scholars, who Martin Parker said didn't really want to be in a business school. So they invented this thing called critical management studies, which they write about and complain about all the time. But what business schools have done is provide a route for working class academics, um, unlike people's experience in the humanities or some other areas of the business school. And one of the interesting things myself and Hugh Thomas, we interviewed quite a number of industrial relations academics a couple of years ago. And a lot of people have come to academia through in industrial relations, through maybe the union movement. A lot of people have working class backgrounds, or they're interested in the lives of working people, and that's why they do research in this area. One of my former colleagues at Bristol in the School of Education, Bruce McFarlane, has written about this. And he says that it's not so much about your social class as your academic class. And what determines whether people progress in the academy is much more about the institutions where you work. Because people who work in certain institutions are better networked, they have greater access to colleagues who are supportive, know how to win research grants, publish papers, etc. And so this idea of academic social class is derived from leveraging the kind of benefits that we get from the reputational prestige of our institutions. It always amazes me that Bristol comes out in the top 100 universities in the world. And you can think, well, how does that happen? And the esteemed vice chancellor at the University of Cardiff, that's given you so much trouble at the time, when she was at Bristol, she always used to say, Bristol is world famous in the UK. And I think that's kind of quite a way of explaining maybe some of the reputational prestige. Now, the thing about the British University Industrial Relations Association was that it was a very kind of exclusionary kind of organization at first. And it took a long time before, for example, we admitted teachers from, for example, there was a lot of trade union education in the 1970s, in 60s and 70s in higher education, further education colleges, etc. And this is a quote from a discussion in 1964 about the quality of teaching in some of these institutions, and that the admission of some of these people would lower the status of the association, and we will be taken over by people who know little about the subject. So the association has always been a research-focused association. And while there's been, there's evidence of people sharing teaching materials and other things, the research, the activities of the association have always been focused around teaching. And this is this idea of the field of industrial relations and the people who work on it being based in these kind of guilds and supported by this particular association. This is one of my favorite quotes from the research that we did recently when we interviewed industrial relations academics, where we distinguish between, we call them seasoned academic researchers rather than senior. And this sense that some people were just fortunate of joining the academy at a certain time. There was less pressure on us to publish. There was more access to funds. There was more public interest in industrial relations. So maybe we were just lucky that we entered the profession at a certain time. We actually published this paper in an American journal. We thought they probably wouldn't understand what somebody meant by a lucky bunch of fucking scousers. But there is this, but what you then also see, kind of qualifying that, is that on the other hand, you also have to acknowledge people's drive to get things done, that people have this, suddenly develop a passion for this. I was talking to a colleague last night on the balcony who said, well, there was a certain thing that they wanted to do in their career, but they realized they just weren't kind of motivated enough. But then when they went back to university and did a labor course, they suddenly got really enthused by this and kind of motivated to do research and do well. So this brings me back to Richard's book and the idea of a fairy tale. So what Richard says in the opening lines of his book is that once upon a time there was this field known as industrial relations. To those of us who commenced our careers in the heyday of industrial relations, the world appears transformed. The subject has been almost universally displaced, transfigured, or at least rebranded, as in the title of the present book. fairy tales typically have a happy ending. If you go to the final chapter in Richard's book, there's no happy ending. It's all about the New World Disorder, no jobs on a dead planet, and the plague years, not the pandemic years, but the plague years. So it's kind of quite a pessimistic interpretation of industrial relations and our subject. Now, when you look at the research on academic disciplines and professional associations, there's basically been thought to be about three typical responses when particular fields of study or disciplines are threatened. The first is that you get withdrawal to the core areas of strength and to just kind of strengthen your identity and your boundaries, which in our case might be trade unions, collective bargaining, industrial conflict. You move closer to a stronger discipline and form a strategic alliance, such as economics. So, yeah, people like me might make a decision to go and work in a school of economics, finance, and management. Or you reconstitute yourself within a newer and larger field of study, and you try to dominate the discourse of that. And you can think about, the way in which industrial relations academics teach human resource management courses, for example. Now, if you think about withdrawal, one of the things that really struck me a couple of years ago when we gave Ralph Darlington a BUIRA fellowship, he said, I've been teaching for 30 years, trying to convince people of the importance of industrial relations. And just as I retired, look what happened. Now, having listened to the papers by Dave Liddon and also Andy Hodder yesterday, there's maybe some different interpretation of how big this particular spike was in terms of the way the conflict is. But we all know that the issues of industrial relations don't go away. These are fundamental to the nature of employment relationships and the world of work. Having said that, if you think about what's happened to the American Association and it's the way it's been associated much more closely with unions and collective bargaining, over there, the kind of importance of the subject has declined almost in tandem with the decline of unions and collective bargaining. And I'll come back to that later. The second is this idea of creating an alliance with other fields of study. Somebody like myself might look at economics. The Nobel Prize last year in economics was won by Akameglu, Johnson, and Robinson, who've recently published a book on power and progress, which is a 1,000-year history of the impact of technological change on workers and working conditions. Now, what they say is pretty close to what we would anticipate, that a lot of the digital technologies are pushing things in an anti-labor direction. While they're not too kind of explicit about the need for a revival of unions and collective bargaining, that's clearly the implication of their research. And they also talk about the need for changes in universities around the discourse and around the way we talk about these things, because we know that people who are educated in MBAs and business and economics more generally, if you look at some of the work of Pfeffer and others on the attitudes of economics and business students, they are much more towards that kind of labor is a cost, green competition, etc. Now, we could say that this boat has already sailed, because at the very first meeting of the forerunner of BUIRA, the Inter-University Study Group on Industrial Relations, there was a debate about whether industrial relations should be seen as a subfield of economics. That idea was lost, and it was, and the consensus was that industrial relations should be a field of study where all the different social sciences, sociology, politics, law, history, etc., would have something to say about the subject. The third option of reconstitution is probably something that in various ways most of us are familiar with, that is something that we've already done. In 1995, BUIRA was asked to explain to the ESRC what industrial relations was all about. John Purcell was president at the time, and this is a definition that most of us would be kind of familiar with and fairly comfortable with, that industrial relations is concerned with all aspects of the employment relationship. It's not a discipline as such, but a cognate area of study. It's an important area of management research, but as most people would say, we don't do research for management, we do research about management that way. And it's a concern with national, international, all these things that influence the nature of the employment relationship. when we talk to industrial relations academics about what they teach, you will remember at Birmingham a few years ago, Paul Blyton and Paul Edwards and Andy Hodder did that little survey of industrial relations academics, and there were quite a few who reported that they still teach courses with industrial relations or employment relations in the title. But when we talked about, in particular, teaching human resource management, most of the colleagues that we spoke to talked about the fact that they adopt an industrial relations approach to this. Some were a bit more bullish than others, but it was pretty clear that people were keen to talk to students about the nature of employment relations. One note of caution on this was that one thing that we did pick up was that more seasoned academic researchers were more confident about doing this than were early career researchers, especially early career researchers who felt they were a bit isolated in a business school where they didn't have many colleagues in similar kind of fields. So they felt some of those pressures more keenly. So it seems to me that there are kind of intellectual, industrial, and institutional challenges that we face. And these have quite significant impacts on our research, teaching, the kind of work that we're expected to do now with the REF in terms of impact and service. So if you just think about the intellectual challenges of having to teach human resource management within particular institutions, because we find ourselves in business schools, we've got that issue to kind of address. Given all the changes in industry, and you could argue that a lot of the kind of original methods for industrial relations in terms of our research methods, who we spoke to, how we focused and did research, was that intellectual stroke industrial thing. And when the industrial landscape changes, how is that impacting our research? I always maintain that service is right at the heart of this because, as scholars and academics, contrary to the advice from Irina last night in a little comedy turn, it is really important that we are involved in some of these, what we might call service activities, being on research committees, all kinds of committees in the school, editorial work in journals, etc. Now, going back to Bruce McFarlane, he says that those who want to continue to resist the demands of this kind of industrialized research academy are likely to represent a dwindling group of individuals hanging on to a set of values that universities believe to be outdated idealism. It raises the question in my mind, well, what does outdated idealism look like, and how do we slay the dragon in our fairy tale? The other quote here is from Peter Fleming's book on how universities die, and he has a piece in the Journal of Management Studies that looks specifically at business schools, where he argues that these kind of pressures are most keenly felt. So Fleming argues that we're under all these pressures from things like REF, TEF, and KEF. This again was one of our favorite quotes from when we talk to these things, that somebody saying we're managed within an effing inch of our lives. And Fleming makes this argument that academics are on your own. We're becoming increasingly kind of individualized, detached from our workplaces, for example, with remote working, etc. But we won't be left alone because of all these demands that are being placed on us. So are we actually on our own, or to what extent does, for example, does BUIRA have our back? Now, outdated idealism. I'm very conscious of the fact that as a senior academic researcher, currently on research leave, approaching retirement, I probably look like outdated idealism. I'm currently on research leave, but I'm not on sabbatical, because we don't have a system of sabbatical within our business school. You don't have a right to time off. You have to apply for it. And under the scheme that I apply for, we have these university research fellowships, you're competing with academics from across the university, not just in your school, but right across the university. So here's our friend Bruce McFarlane again saying, well, even things like sabbatical, the whole nature of these things has changed. From this conception of sabbatical as a period of rest, recuperation, and academic travel. Imagine saying that to your university. What are you going to do? Well, I'm going to rest, I'm going to recuperate, and I'm going to travel around the world, no chance. And what I had to do when I applied for this, under the outputs, is put a big list of all the things that I'm supposed to be doing while I'm, all the publications, research grants, and various other things that I'm supposed to be accumulating. Now, here's another view of what idealism might look like. This is a good friend of mine, Brahim Dabschek. Brahim worked at University of New South Wales for many years, and his research increasingly focused on professional sports and the trade unions associations that represented professional sports players. Braham's a St Kilda fan, Aussie rules football. The guy taking the mark here plays for Collingwood, which is my team, who beat St Kilda 108 points to 74 the other week. Now, I bumped into Braham in Sydney earlier this year, and one of the conversations with Braham is, how many book reviews have you done now? Braham has now done 596 book reviews. Now, let's say it takes you 2 days to read a book and write a review. The average working day in Australia is 250, 252 days a year. That means that Braham has spent 5 years of his working life writing book reviews. Now, would you advise any early career researcher today to write a book review? Would that count towards promotion, the ref, or anything else? Absolutely not. So, I mean, it's as I say, you get Braham measures them in like cricket scores. So I said, where are you up to now, Braham? 596. I thought, I wonder how many I've done. I had a look at my CV. I've done 6. I was asked to write a book review of Richard Hyman's concise introduction, and so I thought, well, I better get my score up. So you can see that Richard's not on the cover. I just put his, so just in case you've not met Richard, but look at the faces here. Look at the image of working people 50 years ago in the Marxist introduction to industrial relations. Now, when I wrote the first draft of this book review, I didn't mention anything about the fact that the book was called Employment Relations, whereas the original one was a Marxist introduction to industrial relations. I left myself a couple of 100 words leeway, asked a couple of colleagues to read it, and they both said, oh, why have you not said anything about the fact that 50 years ago it was Marx's introduction to industrial relations, whereas now it's concise introduction to employment relations? And my response to that was, well, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, because I wrote a book on not even employment relations, but employee relations. Now, the story behind this is that Mick Marchington, who is the editor, or one of the editors of this series on management, work and organizations, came to us and said, we want you to write a book on employee relations. So we said, why not industrial relations? And he said, well, we already have a book on industrial relations, the Contemporary Introduction to Industrial Relations by Kessler and Bayliss. If you pick this book up, the first chapter is on the early post-war years. The second chapter is on the 1950s. So it takes you 3 chapters before you get to contemporary industrial relations. If you remember Hugh Clegg's book on the changing system of industrial relations, probably after countless encounters with and debates with Richard Hyman, finally got round to writing a theory chapter. It was at the end of the book, and basically says, you could read this first or last, it doesn't matter. Well, our approach was now theory, contemporary context in terms of a labour market, and then chapters on all the main actors with research-based case studies that could be used for teaching. What we tried to do was write a book that colleagues would want to teach, not that students would want to read. And there is a difference there in terms of what we, the kind of ideas that we want to try and get across to children. I actually went back and had a look at these books because they're quite old now. And in the second edition, we noticed in the dedication that we actually said our children had asked us if our story was illustrated. Were there dinosaurs in this story? And we no. And we actually wrote in the, or I wrote in the preface to this that no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't end up with a happy ending either. So maybe not that different from Richard. Now, the way in which we've tried to interpret the data from the recent study of industrial relations academics is that there are actually lots of synergies between what we do. We often see these as competing demands and a kind of a zero-sum process. So if I sit on a committee, I'll have less time to do something else. Teaching eats into my research time. And how many colleagues have you got who spend most of their life trying to get out of teaching rather than think about the synergies between their teaching and research? So the way we tried to do this was this kind of, there's a pragmatic approach to these things. So, for example, if there's a hiring committee, get yourself on the hiring committee when you've got a job in human resource management, then you've got a better chance of recruiting somebody who knows something about industrial relations, for example. There's a more progressive version of that where people were, emphasized that being on committees meant that they could try to create a more democratic and supportive environment for their colleagues. I was talking to Marco the other day about, about the quality of research journals, and a lot of people recognise that there are these 4-star journals around, and as much as we dislike them, people use them. So a lot of people would say, yeah, we play the publishing game, but we're not just doing that. We're also writing about the wider problems for labour, often for trade unions, for example, writing reports and various other things. So this is one of my other favourite quotes from this study, where somebody said, well, I balance this by the Martin Scorsese line, where you make one film for the studio, then one film for you. Then immediately qualified by that by saying, well, even when I do the one film for the studio, the one paper for the ref, it's still about industrial relations. It's still about the state. So we don't abandon what we're doing. We work out ways of actually doing all these things in order to keep our sanity and keep our. So look, if we then say, well, if we look at the accepted characteristics of a discipline or a field of study, we tick most of these boxes. So we would say, yeah, we have a particular object of research, the employment relationship. We have an accumulated body of research, which is, we have specialist journals where people publish. We have theories and concepts that allow us to understand the research questions that we have. We have our own terminology, but it's not too exclusionary. It's not like some subjects where, it's quite impenetrable. Our research methods have adapted with things like, if you think about WERS and other ways of doing research. What's seen as most crucial in these kind of assessments of disciplines is some institutional manifestation in the form of subjects taught in universities, well, HRM, but also, you can think about people, work and organizations type courses. Respective academic departments, we don't have any of those anymore. I think the LSE was the first created in 1964, probably the last to close a couple of years ago, merged into management. And then also professional associations connected to the subject. So if we don't have some of these things, that means our professional association becomes more. Now, this is the kind of cautionary tale that I raised earlier about in America. We had a discussion earlier today about, well, who can be a member of BUIRA and what about practitioners? Our constitution says quite clearly that it's for academics, and the only time that we have practitioners is when the president can invite 4 people to the conference. Actually says in our constitution. In America, they have practitioners. Those practitioners come along, they want to talk about unions, collective bargaining, dispute resolution, etc. And quite a few people have commented on the fact that that has narrowed the field in America, left them looking at unions and collective bargaining. And a lot of the other work that's being taught, researched and taught, is done by HR people. I had correspondence with John Budd recently. He's the new president of LIRA in America. He said that this year, federal mediation and conciliation staff were not allowed to attend the conference. Anybody want to guess why? Who stopped them going? Yeah, ginger face and orange and blonde hair. They lost a fifth of their program at the conference this year because these people couldn't attend. It just wiped out a fifth of their conference topics. So there are pros and cons that you need to consider about in terms of membership. Now, everybody knows about kind of key milestones. We've talked about how the association has changed with the admission of teachers, early career researchers, the way we changed the conference format, for example, allowing postgraduate researchers to join the association. I just want to say something about membership, because in the 1950s into the early 60s, there were less than 100 members of BUIRA. It went up to over 200 by the 70s, over 300 by the 1980s, over 400 by the 1990s. Our peak year was around 700 members, allegedly, in 2009. And whenever I talk to Alex Wood, our membership secretary, about this, he kind of, well, because lots of people weren't current members, they were still on the rolls, etc. Our current membership is just under 200. If you're at the AGM yesterday, all the research on professional associations says that you need 200 active members to keep them going. So we're right on that threshold. So unless you're encouraging your PhD students to join, And again, this morning at the EDI session, we had this discussion about the fact that some people don't immediately see BUIRA, the Industrial Relations Association, as their home. There's no, there are no departments of industrial relations, very few courses in industrial relations. So there's that thing about, do people see BUIRA as a natural home? So there are kind of three approaches to this idea of scientific associations. One based around the kind of reputational work of the organization. Colleagues with similar interests who read the same kind of literature, come to the same conferences. There's, especially in the sciences, but these kind of technological approach that look at when people are faced with new research questions, how do you go about resolving those or addressing those questions? So a more kind of technologically based or research methods based approach to some of these things. And then the materialist approach of who controls ideas, how those are produced, how they are communicated. So the sociological one talks about this idea of a core of kind of key people who are involved in an association, and then a kind of a periphery around that. And there is Robert Merton, the sociologist, coined this frame of the Matthew effect, which comes from the Bible. I'm going to try and say this. For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have an abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. And the way that's been translated in economic research in particular is the top people get cited all the time by people. And the way that people do research is that, if I cite Richard Hyman, everybody will, oh yeah, that's a safe reference to kind of use. And it therefore can narrow the field of studies. We've talked about the fact that BUIRA now is a much more diverse community. No longer just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but there's a very different kind of membership and constitution, although again, it's something that we need to keep an eye on. The technological, Peter Ackers, who's always a pot stirrer, has talked about industrial relations as a problem-solving field, not a science-building field. But the old aphorism that industrial relations was a pound of facts and only an ounce of theory, I think we can reject that. And there's been real kind of change in terms of the methods that people use, greater diversity in method. Even going back to Christine Edwards' quote about the approach that she adopted that upset people way back in the 1970s. And then there's this kind of materialist approach, which is one that we've picked up on, because here the argument is it's about the connectedness of the employment sphere to other fields. There's our friend Ed again. You're watching, Ed. Look, you're up here, guys. Pay attention. Get off your phone. Come on. So and there's an argument that the conflict of ideas in our subject, as and the fact that there are these contrasting approaches, enlivens the subject area. So it's no longer dominated by these kind of strong core of the LSE, Oxford, Industrial Relations Research Unit, Warwick, Keele, and we're much more dispersed. And what we hope, what myself and Hugh talked about, was the potential strength of weaker ties between people. That we can make connections with labour geographers, for example, at this conference, or other groups, and try to connect with people in cognate fields. And I think this is this idea that creativity comes from a lot of these connections that people can make. And I think one of the important things about conferences like this is that people actually talk to each other, not just in the meetings, but outside the meetings, about how you actually do research, the reality of doing work in our field, and this whole process of socialization and enculturation. So the fact that we have an annual meeting, an annual conference, and if we can put on other events, this is really important, because I mean, all right, it's a cartoon, it's a bit of a joke, but that is the reality. We spend most of our time gathering data, a very short space of time writing things up. But when you write things up, you often have a very short method section, and then it's all about the data. And not only that, it's depersonalized. We very rarely put ourselves in the narrative. And one of the things I commented on when we gave an award to Jane Holgate a couple of years ago is how Jane actually puts herself in the process and talks about how she engaged with people in terms of research methods. we talked about this morning as well, that as an association and as a stewards team, we can try to set the agenda for industrial relations in terms of what we think are the most important themes or issues that we can pick up on. We never want to be exclusionary. So, the call for papers is always general enough for everybody to be able to participate. But it's also about trying to focus our attention on some of the things that we do or don't do. So, the thing about Donovan a few years ago at Bristol was about, how do industrial relations scholars get more involved in policy debates? Why is it that when we had the Taylor Review, they went to the Royal Society of Arts, for heaven's sakes, rather than the academic community? So these are, actually doing these conferences, setting the themes, working with groups in other universities that are putting on these our conferences allows us to shape some of these in the way that we do with, for example, plenary sessions. We talked about that this morning, and there's some of the support that we give for PhD students as well. So the way I think about this is that, in terms of what we do and what our association does can have a direct impact on lots of people, our students, all the other co-researchers that we work with, trade unionists, managers. There are indirect effects because the ideas that we propose and propagate helps unions represent their members, helps managers think about HR policies or whatever it might be. And the final right-hand column might seem a bit kind of fanciful, but if you think about the role of industrial relations scholars in the past, there have been ideas that have helped to transform fundamental social relationships within our society. This is from my friend Bill McCarthy again, but saying in the 1960s, it seemed that half the membership of BUIRA were working for the National Board for Prices and Incomes, and the other half were working for the Royal Commission. And again, could we get back to that kind of position where the association is playing a more proactive role in policy making? I tend to be an optimistic person. You may or may not have noticed that. So I'm a kind of a glass half full, maybe even a lot of the time I think my glass is too full. But pessimism can become self-fulfilling. As an intellectual stance, it's perfectly defensible. The world is terrible. Everything's going in the wrong direction. But adopting that kind of position can often blind us to practical possibilities and political opportunities. Even if we're a kind of glass half full type person, it's more likely to expose avenues for a progressive change. And I think it's only when we get engaged in a bit more productive debate about the future of industrial relations that we can start to imagine a world of work and family life that's actually different from the present. I like the words of Raymond Williams, who said that to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. And I think what BUIRA does for me, what I hope it does for other people, is it reminds us what it means to be an industrial relations scholar and how to do industrial relations scholarship, even in the places that we find ourselves, even in the University of Bristol Business School, which is not the place that I wanted to be when I first went there. Q&A. You'll see I like these cartoons, PhD comics. There's one for every occasion. I know that not meant to trivialize things, but this is I've got a full list of references. So if anybody wants the PowerPoint, I think we've been trying to record this session, so we'll try and put this up. But we've got a full list of all the references. Here's another one: the evolution of intellectual freedom. This is me down at the end researching peace. Hopefully not. I'm sure that the association is in very safe hands with the Cardiff team. Don't laugh. But seriously, if folks have got any questions or comments on this, you'd be most welcome. I'm aware that most people will be looking at the clock and thinking about trains back home. But thanks very much.